we have as soon as possible. So the the Local Catch Network has started up this meet and greet series, so as to get just like more conversations going between more folks in the network, because one of the most important parts of a local catch network is community, is like conversation, is connection, because we all know that's the only way food systems really work, and so we want to help be a conduit for that, for you know for as much as for whatever capacity we can, and get these conversations going around a lot of different topics. We had one a few months ago around institutional purchasing, and some really awesome examples of folks in our network who have been able to like bring that into their local catch. And today we are going to be having some conversation around seaweed and Seaweed Commons, a really amazing position paper that the folks here with me have put a lot of great work into and a lot of great thought. So yeah, without further ado, I will pass it initially to Amanda to I'll pass it to Amanda to introduce herself, and then let others, and then they can talk about the paper.
Well, good morning or afternoon, everyone, or evening, depending on where you are. My name's Amanda Swinimer, and I live on the west coast of Vancouver Island in BC, Canada. And in 2003, I began my business, Dakini Tidal Wilds, hand harvesting wild edible seaweeds. And I teach people about seaweeds, and I'm the author of a book all about seaweeds. And in 2017, I believe, Severin approached me. She had formed the Seaweed Commons, which is a international community of small scale seaweed harvesters, farmers, seaweed advocates, scientists, seaweed enthusiasts, in order to share information, to share challenges and solutions, and to have a stronger unified voice in response to issues that we see happening both locally and internationally. And that's sort of how the Seaweed Commons came together. And we're really happy to be here and invited by Local Catch to have this conversation today. And really excited to be releasing our position paper today, which we will definitely be talking about this afternoon. So I'll turn it over and let Severin introduce herself.
I'm Severin Fleming. I'm coming to you from the coast of Maine, right on the border with Canada in Cobscook Bay, where this is my 5th season. I'm a harvester of wild seaweeds and a farmer of wild gardens on Smithereen Farm. And I'm also part of Seaweed Commons, which has grown out of the work of Greenhorns, an organization I've been directing for 15 years, which has been all about young farmers on the land, supporting young organic farmers. And that lens of organizing for the kind of freshman class of people getting involved in seaweeds has been helpful as we're observing and confronting some of the new structural changes to the seaweed sector that we're entering, which looks different from month to month. And those of us who are right on the water have a kind of seal's eye view on some of these changes. And overall, I think our goal for today is to welcome more people into this space, welcome more stakeholders to see their role as co-authors in the governance of our commons, and that we have a shared responsibility in our shared waters to participate in the regulatory updates required of this moment in history. So we'll talk about history, we'll talk about economy, we'll talk about coastal people, we'll talk about all the complexity that is the realm of seaweed. And it's lovely to be a part of this working group, which continues to grow. Just in the last hour, we had 3 new signatories sign on, so that's fun. Off to you, Avery.
Thanks, everyone. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. It's great to see familiar names and faces on here, folks I haven't seen since pre-COVID. I'm Avery, and my partner Catherine and I co-founded Daybreak Seaweed in 2017. We're both seaweed lovers and seaweed harvesters, and now we partner with regenerative seaweed farmers on the west coast of the US. And we transform their delicious seaweed into nourishing kitchen staples. And our goal really is to grow well-being for our customers and for our community. And we see our business as a tiny little piece in this beautiful mosaic of community-led food system transformation. And I'm excited to be on this call today with all of you so we can share the thinking we've been doing about the Seaweed Commons and about our oceans as a commons in general, and to learn from your experience whether you also are fans of algae or just of our oceans or fisheries, because I feel like there's so much that to be learned in this community to build a better way forward.
Excited to hear from everyone. So I do want to remind folks that we're gonna get to hear a lot from them on what they've been up to and like the work and their work and their like ideas. But we're also gonna have space for communication for a conversation between the folks on our call, because I'm sure there's folks here who also have some really awesome things to share, ask, or like contribute. But to start off the conversation, I wanted to kick it to any of the 3 of you to just mention, like, talk about what is this position paper that y'all have mentioned, and what's going on with it.
We should let Amanda go first.
Thanks. This position paper kind of came about. I'm very involved with Slow Fish Canada. There's a really tight group of us, mostly on the West Coast, and we use our network and our resources to respond to issues that affect small scale fisheries and things like that. And we're a really tight knit group, and I kind of approached them looking for ideas for ways to ensure that the wild seaweed ecosystem and the well-being of coastal communities is protected in light of a very fast growing and largely unregulated seaweed aquaculture industry. And they suggested the first thing to do would be to write a position paper and really get the details of sort of what our concerns are, what our vision is, what research really needs to be done in order to ensure that this industry is developed in a way that does protect biodiversity and the well-being of coastal ecosystems. And I was already a member of the Seaweed Commons, so I brought this idea to them, and it was just a beautiful collaboration. So that's sort of the origins of the position paper. And what we're really hoping it does is start a conversation and sort of glue together a network of people who can collaborate to get the research done on both the ecological impacts of proposed large-scale seaweed aquaculture and the socioeconomic impacts of proposed large-scale seaweed aquaculture. And so we can get some of this research moving forwards and develop a really cohesive regulatory system that ensures these protections that is uniquely created from region to region. So if Avery or Severin has something to add to that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in for a moment. Yeah, thank you, Amanda, for that. And it's been such an amazing process working with the Seaweed Commons to create this. And I've learned so much. It really felt like the right time because we work with seaweed farmers primarily in Alaska, and separately they were coming to us talking about some of these concerns about the rapidly growing industry and about this risk of losing local and community control. And yet there wasn't really something that tied all those voices together. So that's something we're trying to do with this position paper. And we would love, more folks to read it, react to it, start this conversation, build on this. We felt like we just needed a document that could kind of ground this conversation and to use it to move forward. So I would just wanted to read our position because the paper's linked in the chat, but obviously you guys probably haven't had a chance to read it. So our just general position statement is, as a group of seaweed growers, harvesters, scientists, and advocates, we support a collaboratively managed and locally controlled seaweed industry. The Seaweed Commons supports an ecosystem-based approach to the development of the industry that is informed by research to ensure that farms are in appropriate locations of an appropriate size and protect biodiversity. And I think those are elements that a lot of seaweed farmers in the US would agree with. And there's, I would say there's different case studies in different places from BC to Alaska to Maine to California, where different elements of that are going in a more collaboratively managed and locally controlled direction. And then there's places where it really seems that corporate and industrial control is moving in quite quickly, especially as there's an influx of a lot of financial support for kind of these silver bullet solutions. And we can talk about that more later. Severin, would you want to jump in?
Well, I should say that Greenhorns is a member of the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance, and very much the movement of agroecology that we are a part of on land recognizes that the sovereignty and self-determination of rural communities in authoring the form of their economy is pretty important, and especially if we're looking in a global context. And that's very much the case with seaweed. So the question of whether we have government facilitated investment or government facilitated regulatory oversight that values the artisanal and coastal peoples, smaller businesses, local ownership, these are values that are very important to especially these places where there's very nice clean water and cold water in the world, which is the places where seaweed likes to grow. And so the kind of unique selling point of these places is exactly the fact that this is where a locally owned, conservation-minded, suitably sited business can thrive, that is sensitive to the marine environment and the other habitants in the mammalian and other trophic realms. And so, but concerningly, our position paper comes into a space that's pretty congested with other position papers, and groups are forming, alliances are being made, presentations are all over the internet, and you can look and see for yourself at the media space, the investment space, how the conservation organizations and foundations are positioning themselves, and a lot of different views on how either the blue commons or the blue economy should proceed. And not all those voices have equal power. We can say that for sure. But what we can also say for sure is that the more literate of a community, active community we have accompanying this sector as it matures, the safer we will be together. And we really do want to encourage more people to join, from the scientific community, from the conservation community, from the kind of rural economic development community, who are, really adjacent to these issues, which spill over out from seaweed into many other realms. And, we chose the name Seaweed Commons because we recognize that if you have leases in the commons, in the public trust, in the ocean, and those leases are saleable, that's essentially the privatization of the ocean. And in all of this hype that we get to participate in, this simple story of, seaweed will save the world, what often gets forgotten is that seaweed is already saving the world. And seaweed has been a large contributor to the creation of our atmosphere and to the world, mother of the world. So the question of how we're relating in this moment to the kind of investor fantasias and speculation pressures and kind of boom town conversations that are going on in bioplastics and bioenergy and large scale arrays and all sorts of other promises that are being made, talking about breeding kelp, domesticating the kelp varieties, etc. A grounded approach that involves more stakeholders seems to be preferable. Now, we have a few events coming up that we are announcing at this time. Is that right?
Yeah, do it.
So we refer you to the Seaweed Commons website, where you can read about the upcoming webinar places, and you can read the position paper right now. But we're going to be presenting at Sea Greek Culture Conference in Portland. We have other, shoot, I'm not looking at it. Do you have one in front of you, anybody? Okay, anyway, we refer you to the website to join. Oh, because Elena, because how we all got together is we just started Zooming, and we were Zooming in Hawaii, we were Zooming in Scotland, we were Zooming in Norway, we were Zooming in Alaska, and each time it would be kind of, 3 people come in, another person comes out, another person comes in, and the thematics of our inquiry and of what we were observing were very much shared, and that's exactly the thematics that we brought forward in this paper. But we want to continue Zooming, and the Zoom room is open. So we've already got a little lineup of next guests to kind of invite in as respondents and collaborators, we hope. And so maybe you guys would join for one of those also.
What's the, if folks on this call would be interested in being part of that, what's the best way that they could get involved?
Well, Seaweed Commons is coordinated by the wonderful Elena, and they can put their email. I guess we'll invite this whole list to those events. Does that sound okay?
Cool. So in the follow-up email, we can include that.
Yes.
Great. Awesome.
There's some really wonderful people introducing themselves here.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's already seems like some really awesome like connective points. But yeah, so a question I want to ask before we kind of like jump to audience is just we've talked about, like, y'all got to talk about the kind of like the positions y'all are taking, the analysis of where the systems are headed and everything. But like as like seaweed harvesters, what is your work actually looking like right now? Like, are these like privatization efforts like really, like, how much are they affecting your like daily work? How much are you finding yourselves like starting to be cornered by like certain forces in the market? yeah, so like what directions your work like going in right now? Like what are some of the things you're facing? And I'll pitch that to anyone.
Yes, I can start because I'm in a different position than, I'm really in a unique position because I don't farm seaweed and I never have. So as a wild harvester, I hand harvest seaweed by pruning method, and I sell it. I don't do anything to it. I just dry it and I sell either direct to chefs or direct to customers through my website. So my, at this time, like my market doesn't even overlap with large industrial scale seaweed farmers. They're not selling, like in BC, they're not selling dried seaweed. They're making it into products, or sometimes they're not even growing it for food at all. So in terms of, my livelihood being threatened by a market, that's not happening. But if anything happens to harm the wild native seaweed ecosystem where I live, then absolutely, not only would my livelihood be affected, but my heart would start to hurt at the same time. So I'm really sort of see myself as a seaweed ambassador, and my specific passion in this is really to protect the wild seaweed diversity. And where I live in the Pacific Northwest, we have the greatest seaweed diversity on the planet. There's an estimated 650 species, and we have the greatest diversity of kelp on the planet. We have 30 species of kelp that grow and thrive here. So that's really how I came into the Seaweed Commons. So I'll pass it on to maybe Avery.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, so, and I love that angle, and it's so important. I love hearing of you as a seaweed ambassador, like the Lorax or something. I come at it from a different angle. I grew up on a farm and have spent my whole life working with land and ocean farmers from the US to East Africa. And East Africa is actually in Tanzania, where I first saw seaweed farming and got really excited about it. And my work there in Mozambique was really around agroecology and working with La Via Campesina and advocacy groups there towards a more sustainable, equitable, resilient food system in the face of a lot of corporate and industrial pressure to quote unquote modernize the food system. And so I would say that I come to this, the concerns I have around this really are around this budding industry in North America that is an industry that's existed forever in long times in other parts of the world, and is a food that's been consumed forever in coastal communities around the world. But I come to this really seeing that threat of, we have this opportunity to build a more equitable and resilient industry, seaweed industry, and there's all of this pressure that's moving quite quickly in to change that and to basically mimic a lot of the like formats and control and privatization of land agriculture. And I just would hope that we could have learned from these mistakes in land agriculture, mistakes that have cost us, have impacted the Gulf, have destroyed soils all across, the North America, and not make those same mistakes in the ocean. And now I see that there's so much power behind this like silver bullet, like I said before, climate solution. And And that narrative really is being pushed really hard on seaweed. So what I would say, sorry if this isn't totally linear, is that there, like Severin mentioned earlier, seaweed is amazing. Seaweed is curative. It is absorbing carbon and nitrogen from the water column. It is, mitigating impacts of climate change in local waters. It is providing habitat for marine life. It offers this amazing food for people that's high in nutrients and delicious. And it can be farmed in a way that supports all of those things. It really can. And we work with farmers who are doing that and doing that in a just way, doing that in an equitable way, and trying to build this industry out in a way that we truly support and believe in. But I think they are feeling the threats of all of the financing and funding that's coming in to do these large scale seaweed monocultures and essentially make a lot of mistakes that we've made on land, which can be much more disastrous, honestly, in the ocean, just because of the nature of the ocean ecosystems. So I feel that threat as far as the industry, as far as our products for Daybreak Seaweed. We want to feed our community. We want to be a small scale seaweed products producer. We don't in particular feel any competition from industrial producers at this point, just because we have amazing customers, amazing community who really value the scale and the quality that we produce. But I could imagine in the future that with really strong marketing and communications campaigns, that some larger corporations could kind of start to eat into our market. But that's definitely not the main threat or the main reason for us participating in work like the Seaweed Commons in this position paper.
Well,
you want to jump in?
There's going to be some low tides starting on the 13th of June. As some of you who are near the ocean will know, that the moon affects the ocean, and sometimes the tides are higher than other times. And in my part of Maine, we have 22-foot tides. We're like the backsplash of the Bay of Fundy, where they have 60-foot tides, which is the biggest tides in the world. When the tides are low, more of the intertidal community is exposed, and what are called subtidal species are exposed to the air. And so that's the time when we can go down either on foot or in a little boat and carefully collect the wild species that we like to eat. In our case, it's dulse, gracilaria, alaria, saccharina, nori, sea lettuce, digitata. Those are the ones that we harvest here in Maine. And we don't have the kind of diversity that Amanda has. We mostly have Ascophyllum covering the majority of our intertidal zone. And Ascophyllum is the kind of kelp forest of the North Atlantic. And Ascophyllum makes an amazing bath. And so we do a lot of bathing in seaweed. But Ascophyllum is habitat for 100 species and is currently being mined as a wild forest, being converted into fertilizer in the global commodity supply chain. And I think one of the things that gets left out of the story a lot in this, kind of seaweed, like meringue, fantasia, soft serve narrative that gets spun out a lot lately, is that we already live in a world defined by global supply chains for seaweed. So here in Maine, we have Rockland-based plant that's now owned by DuPont that imports seaweed from the Philippines, red seaweeds from the Philippines. These red seaweeds are made into toothpaste and ink and chocolate fudge, and they give a good mouthfeel to all the processed foods. So there's a multi-billion-dollar industry currently operating that has nothing to do with the future that's in the present, with coastal communities, many times women as operators of seaweed farms. East Africa, the Philippines, South Pacific are concentrations. And in those places you have, little monocultures of small, marginal coastal people producing a commodity that is valued at very small value relative to how much work it is, and is being exported and processed by big aggregators and processors. Now, where we are in Maine, there's a handful of small seaweed companies that are locally owned and conservation minded. Some of them have been around for 40 years. Some back to the landers who wanted to do macrobiotic food just got some of these companies started here, and there's a Maine Seaweed Council that has a great harvester's guide that I refer you to. And those seaweed companies in Maine kind of each have their little zones where they operate and are pretty respectful of one another's zones. There's a kind of a cultural commons where people have territories. That's what they would call an informal or a customary rights framework that is separate from the regulations of the state. And so as a harvester, as a private citizen, I can harvest 50 pounds a day, just for subsistence or for your garden. But then if you have a commercial license, you can harvest a lot more. And the guys who are harvesting the wild seaweed forest for fertilizer, for horticulture, for cannabis, for citrus, for dairy, that kelp forest is valued about $50 for a 50-pound bag of dried kelp. And the harvesters are working, a tide, and they're making about $300 for an entire boatload of kelp. So again, a very low value marginal workforce human. The seaweeds that we're harvesting, we're selling for $30 and $40 a pound. We harvest by hand, we dry it on trays in the greenhouse. We have fans that blow to get the water moisture out. It's a very, like right now it's misty and all of the seaweed in my garden is re-moistened. It's an extraordinary participator. Seaweed is an extraordinary participator with the water cycle. And in fact, these low tides expose more intertidal, and that the vapor, the iodide and sulfur dioxide. Oh my God, my literacy went away. But anyway, the clouds of coastal areas are impacted by the seaweed beds. Anyway, so we have to get the seaweed dry and keep it dry and then get it nicely packaged. And then we also sell, value added products. So we blend it with our shiitakes and a sweet bay and garlic and turmeric, and we make broth, and because we believe in it being a condiment, not a superfood or a junk food, or that really this is a precious nourishing, wonderful, healing mother algae. So in our world, we have the 13th through the 19th year in Maine, where we have like an open house. So anybody who wants to come and learn about seaweed can come and harvest with us and participate. And we have little flashcards to learn all the different species. And we've had a tremendous interest of people wanting to kind of get back into relationship with this glossy, vibrant world. And yeah, you can sign up on Greenhorns for seaweed. We call it low tides work week or something. Yeah. I have so many things I want to say, but I feel like we're supposed to go to the Q&A, and that way we can bring all the thematics together. So I'm going to start shutting up again.
It's all good, Severin. You just got to say it in an appealing enough way that all these folks will want to keep having this conversation with you after the webinar.
Okay.
Yeah, so, I mean, again, there's so much here. There's so many things to dig into. There's so much like awesome stuff being put in the chat too. And so like I want to say, just in terms of conversation, the second half, we're definitely going to dig more into like, points of collaboration, points of like coordination, opportunities. But we're doing some just kind of like background and like more, what's it called? Just like seeing where similarities and differences lie. And so actually want to pitch a question to the audience right now of just like, what are some of like the similarities and differences y'all are seeing in your work, in your spaces? I see we've got some like wild caught fisheries here. We got some other like food system advocates. We got some other, it seems we got some other seaweed harvesters. Yeah, we definitely want to, have a conversation with everyone. So if folks are comfortable, yeah, anyone want to share some of their, anything they're vibing with, or any differences they're seeing in their walk of earth? And you can just feel free to unmute.
Well, I
and
think
speak.
that what you notice if you tune into the seaweed people around is that they're very independent thinkers. And I feel like walking on slippery rocks might have something to do with that. And I don't know what has to do with that, but the question of who wins when large scale financialization of carbon markets and conservation and our coastal waters starts to enter the picture. So I think you have one thing is a shared healthy skepticism of these big promises. And, in the case of Amanda, in the case of Avery, they have the salmon, they have the story of salmon right in front of them. So the story of the large salmon farms, so-called farms that are in fact confined animal feeding operations that bring genetically modified corn and soy, mix it with West African fish meal and a lot of preservatives and poop up the waters and create disease issues for wild salmon and block the migration of wild salmon. And that's what's proposed now along the coast of Maine. Where I am in Cobscook Bay is the largest place for salmon farms in Maine, but we have now 8 new farms proposed. The question of whether a 100-acre aquaculture of kelp aquaculture would be welcomed here, I think culturally no, because we have a culture, fisheries culture that is really owner operated in Maine, and we have a very diverse fishery in where I live in Cobscook in Washington County. 1 in 10 people are in fact holders of a commercial fishing license. So, we actually really rely on fish in the same way as they do in Alaska. But that cultural consensus about working waterfront and subsistence and preserving a way of life in these small towns, I don't think is reflected in the regulatory arena. And the industry domination of that agenda setting and the writing of the rules is pretty shocking. Considering how much the kind of kelp can help narrative dances around in the rhetoric of conservation organizations and coastal organizations, their commitment to accompanying the regulatory updates that are needed has been much less than the happy stories that they pump out. And right now in Maine, you can have a 100-acre lease for aquaculture. And so, one of the things we've seen in Long Island and other Northeast farms is a couple years ago, Green Wave was saying $1 a pound for wet kelp. In Stonington, they were saying $5 a pound, $10 a pound for fresh wet kelp. Now the story is 10 cents a pound. This new indigenous run kelp farm off of Long Island. So, right there you have as soon as you have a huge production, all of a sudden, all these small artisanal businesses will have competition from cheap kelp and a junk food approach to the project, to the process, to the sector. Okay,
Yeah,
somebody else.
I'll just jump in for a sec with one of the really unfortunate things is how the media has latched on to the marketing campaigns of not only like large scale seaweed aquaculture corporations, but our federal governments, both in Canada and the US, are promoting this same this same vision, which is totally not not accurate and doesn't have science to back it up. Like, the fact is that, you know, wild algae produces an estimated 50 to 80% of global oxygen. It absorbs an estimated 1/3 of our carbon dioxide. And as Severin mentioned, it's critical. It forms the nuclei of clouds, which is critical to regulating global climate. And anything that we do to jeopardize that wild algae ecosystem, which is already being, some species are being affected by ocean acidification, the microalgae are, is not only gonna not help, you know, reduce global warming and, you know, suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but it could have the opposite effect. So while there is lots of science to back up the fact that wild kelp forests specifically sequester large amounts of carbon dioxide by pieces of the kelp that break off, sink down to the ocean abyss, and can stay there for millennia, there is no science yet. And now some scientists are starting to speak out and say, you know, we don't know this, and it could actually, depending on where farm seaweed ends up as it's the final product, it could be having the opposite of effect of carbon sequestration. So a really problematic issue is the way that seaweed farming is presented in the media. It's all the bigger, the better. We need to do it bigger to, you know, sequester carbon, when really it's the small scale regenerative projects that are legitimately going to help affect climate. And like Avery said, especially helping to regulate climate on more of a regional level. So.
Right. And I think it's like anything, any industry where it's so much more nuanced than you read in the media. And I think maybe seaweed's just like too foreign or out there for people, that this media rhetoric that's simple and bigger the better, like Amanda's saying, is just caught on like wildfire. And what we're saying is we need to support these, just like Amanda said, regenerative, restorative, like small scale, appropriately placed, community controlled farms, which exist and are being built and just aren't getting that support, government or VC or whatever support that these other companies are. And we need to support them, not just financially, but through the narrative, through the media, and also through science. Like, we need more research on these farms and how this can be done so well. We work with a farmer in Alaska near Homer that it grows oysters and mussels and then has seaweed, tons of species, more than you would ever see in any of these large scale monocultures, that wild seed on her lines. It's like weeds. They're like growing like weeds in your land farm. And she harvests them, dries them, and we buy them, make them into condiments, make them into seasonings, and sell them to our community. And she sells them locally as well. And like, that is just this beautiful example of a true polyculture that's providing real habitat, and is, you know, at that local level, there is science that seaweed can change the local pH of the water and can help support growth of shellfish. So, and other, and other organisms. So it's like, we just need more funding, more support for research on those kinds of issues, research on how to do it right. So we can start to build out models and stories of operations that are doing this in a sustainable way and in a way that supports wild kelp ecosystem or wild seaweed ecosystems, instead of bringing in these like simplified genetics and potentially diseases and potentially threatening those ecosystems that are doing so much for our planet already.
Well, and just that it's not a simple story. I feel like what's, you know, wonderful about algae is also just how many thematics, like how many areas there are to study. So, if you look in Central America, what's happening is an overgrowth of sargassum is piling up on all the beaches in the Yucatan and the Caribbean. And that's caused by deforestation in the Amazon and more ocean warming and more nutrient coming into the sea, and the sea responding and saying, okay, we're going to make more sargassum. And the sargassum is, producing it's carbon out of the ocean, and then it washes up on beaches where it's considered, a biohazard. You have this massive investment in algae as a biofuel by our Department of Energy, literally hundreds of millions of dollars going into bioenergy, and we're using kelp funding from the government. We also have a lot of interest in using algae for feeding to cows who live in CAFOs to so-called improve their methane production, so helping their digestion. I could go on and on about other areas. Overall, it feels like coming back into remembrance of the evolutionary biology of our planet and the role that algae played in enabling terrestrial life to take shape, that algae is its own kingdom or queendom, and that the many coastal cultures who have engaged in clam gardening, in kind of helping to spread spores of wild forests, in accompanying and tending the wild, and also doing, mariculture using bamboo technologies and seeding onto brush, gathering spat in the context of shellfish. These are long-standing traditions that are almost forgotten by the kind of modern day storytelling. And, we've been working on our farm to have no plastic and to use instead the fungus foam called mycelium to have our flotation buoys. And we've met with lots of excited people who feel the same way, who are, here we are, we want to come into the ocean because we love the ocean. We don't want to be part of the problem. And I feel like that's kind of the whole point of this paper, is to say, let's be involved and let's not be part of the problem.
Yeah, that's great. And just like on a lot of what y'all were saying, it's a lot of, there's so many similarities to like when we hear like wild caught fisheries, like talk about the influence of like offshore fish farms, the impact it's having on their fisheries when they talk about or like in like shellfish aquaculture, there's just so many similar issues that are rising, and also so many similar like innovations like folks are doing. I want to real quick just like pause if anyone in the call wants to also share a story before we move on. Feel free to raise your hand, put it in the chat, or unmute. Going once, going twice. Okay.
They're shy.
So
Love questions if you guys have any.
Don't
Yeah.
be shy.
Don't be shy. We could talk about seaweed all day, but we'd love to learn from you.
Simon, go ahead. You can unmute.
Thanks. Yeah. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, sound great.
Okay, cool. I'm Simon. I'm with an organization called the Ecology Action Center. We're in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Overall, I can't say enough good things about this conversation so far. It's basically like music to my ears at this point, and I'm really happy to have kind of found the group that is working in the directions that you've spoken to so far. Generally speaking, we could put some of the like educational resources that have come up so far around climate and around the relationship between like wild seaweed species and human cultures and the kind of evolutionary history of algae to work in some of our communications like yesterday. We're sort of new to the seaweed landscape, and we're setting up a small nursery and educational center in Nova Scotia to try to help like small scale coastal entrepreneurs get to know seaweed a little better and understand whether or not, exploring the small scale seaweed entrepreneurship landscape might be a good fit for them. And yeah, I haven't read the paper yet that's the basis for this discussion, nor do I know anything about the Seaweed Commons beyond finding the website like a couple hours ago. Anyway, I'm super keen to like continue this conversation and just get to know where you guys are like sharing resources and how we can get more deeply involved in some of the conversational threads that have gone on here.
Thanks, Simon. I actually was a little bit involved with the Ecology Action Center. I graduated from Dalhousie in '99. So it's amazing that you guys are still around.
Yeah, still going strong. We had our 50-year anniversary last year. So we call ourselves Atlantic Canada's oldest and largest environmental nonprofit, for some context. But yeah, seaweed's totally new for us. We do a lot of the kind of policy work that I think the paper is trying to address. And we're actually undergoing in our own province a regulatory review for the whole aquaculture industry. And we're trying to take this opportunity to embed some of the things that have come up here today around seaweed, which is, I think, like in many other places, just generally under researched and at this point under regulated and poorly known relative to other kinds of aquaculture. So this is super helpful.
Great. Yeah, well, hopefully the paper will sort of outline some of the major gaps in policy that need to be filled. Is a big
well
one.
And we see here there's a number of like funders in this room. I just want to say that what he's talking to is the critical need also to educate rural youth and coastal youth that they too could become seaweed farmers, and that I like to say, if I can do it, you could do it. Because I had never operated a boat, I had never tied a knot, I can barely do math. And it's not rocket science letting a suspended line between two buoys that are anchored with moorings in the ocean. It's just like as simple as a puppet show, like like a curtain rod. I mean, it's really and I think that around here anyway, the young people are digging clams and they're selling them to the clam dealer. They're cutting rockweed and they're selling it to the dealer. They're cutting tips, they're selling it to the balsam wreath companies. They're raking blueberries, they're selling it to the two blueberry companies. We have just baked in an extractive natural resource culture as a colony of the. And I think until we invest in ecological literacy and enabling of young people here to see themselves as agents of the kind of economy they want to live in and as authors of that economy, then we will continue to be sold a jobs story by politicians who've been already paid off at the highest levels.
Yeah, and that's exactly the main concern at the political level for us, is that it's very difficult to kind of beat back the tide of the promises of corporate jobs that might come with some of the large scale industrial uses for seaweed and some of the large scale operations that would have to be developed to accommodate those use cases. And I mean, honestly, any support or like resources or shared advocacy work that can be done in that regard to support the notion that a small scale aquaculture economy fits better both within community socioeconomic visioning of their own and also just within the culture of a lot of the coastal areas that folks on this call I think are representing to an extent is like hugely important for us and something we could both benefit from and probably help with as well.
Yeah, and please, any of you, but Simon, thank you so much. And please join us on a Seaweed Commons call. Perhaps that would be a good way. And then also on the Seaweed Commons website, there are a lot of resources that we keep, I don't personally, Elena and Severin keep updating as they come along. And I think the goal of that really is a place to share these resources. But if you want to join our conversations, it would be interesting. We could even have a session more devoted to your part of the world or whatever seemed advantageous.
Well, and also that one of the big roles is to figure out which coastal organizations could be joining in this work. So like this one in Halifax, the Ecology Action Center, you know, in Maine, we have the Seaweed Exchange, we have the Island Institute, we have the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, and each of them are kind of doing a little part of participating in this process. But still, when you go and get your training as a license holder for the state, and you sit there for 4 hours in a conference room for your required training, the slides that you see in front of you say, oh, this is just a placeholder. We don't have our seaweed section developed yet. So here you have a freshman class of people who are getting all sorts of support for business development and processing and all this conversation, but the like basic literacy of how we can be respectful practitioners who are knowledgeable about this ecological context in which we're operating also really deserves investment. You know, we really need to support the educational environment around the entrepreneur class, but also people who we don't consider the entrepreneur class. So that means that right now in Alaska and in BC, there's a lot of indigenous communities who had defunct aquaculture leases that they weren't using or that had gone into decline, and being told, oh, you know, we're here to teach you how, we'll run the operation for you, and hand over your leases. Well, that's a faster way to get a lease if you're a company that wants to go quickly through the regulatory process. But again, that doesn't necessarily empower the agency of people who've spent millennia interacting with the wild ocean commons. And when that commons becomes a saleable, when that lease is able to be sold, all of a sudden there's an incentive for speculators to come in and initiate and then be able to resell. And that's what happened here with salmon. There were many salmon operations. Now there's one.
Yeah, one thing that we've sort of just briefly touched on here and there, but this, seaweed farms that are, tens of kilometers or 100 kilometers long, this is every single person who loves the ocean and who makes their living on the ocean is going to be affected by this, because it's going to restrict access. In addition to having other unknown effects like shading, water attenuation, things like that. Just at the basic level, if there's a huge seaweed farm there, you can't navigate those waters anymore. So that affects, fishing. We've also, the main group that's been concerned in BC with plans for large scale aquaculture is the shellfish community, because their areas that were historically leased for shellfish farming are being, like Severin said, repurposed and getting collected up very quickly by seaweed aquaculture corporations.
And Johnny, we'll come to your question in a second. Before, I just want to, help with a slight conversation shift. Is like, in talking about all of, all of these things that we're kind of running into. Also, want to make sure we get opportunity to speak to, like, potential like collaborations and and I think we've set the stage well for like why seaweed is an important like space to be paying attention to, regardless of like what sector of seafood you're in. And so, so just like continuing the thread of like opportunities for collaboration, working together, coordination, Johnny, do you have something you want to add? You're muted if you are. Okay, there you go.
Yeah, thanks. You picked me up. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, howdy everybody. Hey, one big question. So I've got like 3 outstanding calls. People called me up in like the last 2 weeks. Like, I want to start a seaweed farm. I want to help save the earth. So a huge question, we've seen promoters of seaweed farms and seaweed farming platforms and everything, both large and small, from both coasts of the US and throughout Europe. And I think we should pay a lot more attention to what's happening in Europe too, with the Safe Seaweed Coalition, and then also the group that Paula Barbietto just put up about the other group, Seaweed for Europe. Just totally, backed by huge, big algae organizations and big money and big blue economy money. But on the smaller aspect, so you've got a family that's fished in Alaska or Maine or New Hampshire, Connecticut. You got and or maybe they're really interested. They've done other things in their lives, and they want to get into this seaweed boom, this new green rush. How about the realities? Where who's making money? Who's losing money? Who's lost their ass? And I'm really concerned about this, because tons of really, really well-meaning people want to get into seaweed farming, want to get into this space, and they don't have sea grants behind them. They don't have industrial investors. They don't have these predatory investment groups, and they're willing to put it on the line. What is the true upside for them, or downside? What are the markets? I mean, how are, besides Barnacle and Maine Sea Vegetables and several other companies, who's making money off of, and how are they making money with which kind of product farms, with which kind of snack forms? Cove out of BC, we got this new one in Puget Sound that's making another little snack. I think there needs to be a sobering reality for the folks that are jumping on the bandwagon, that don't have the wherewithal to lose millions, that don't have Jeff Bezos and Lucas Walton and World Wildlife, Fund behind them. And we really need to support them and give them some understanding of what they're up against. The price of seaweed, the biggest farms in Alaska barely have any markets. They're getting like 50 cents a pound for wet,
Yeah.
And then you talk about, these other super low prices in Maine and on the East Coast and in Europe, and the Africans that are growing seaweed, coalitions are barely getting paid anything, unless they're doing, value added, products and stuff like that. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for that, and for all the resources you've shared throughout this webinar. And it's great to hear your voice. I think that's such an unspoken, or like elephant in the room or whatever, right now, especially, I guess my experience is only in Alaska and California, but it definitely is in Alaska. And we at Daybreak Seaweed, we get emails, every week with people wanting to quit their job and become a seaweed farmer and, save the world through, or end climate change or something through seaweed farming. And it's really hard to tell them that seaweed is amazing. It is saving the world. Seaweed farming can be done beautifully and really well. And like, we want to support their dreams, and the market is way behind. The processing is way behind these grand promises that are being laid out. And like I said earlier in this call, like, I first learned about seaweed farming in Tanzania, where women are working so hard just to sell red seaweeds to a global commodity market at prices they don't control. And then, diseases are wiping through their crops. And this is not the model we want to follow. So at my tiny little company, Daybreak Seaweed, we try and partner directly with the farmer as they're getting going. And actually we're working with, for example, a woman that like I went to middle school and high school with, who her husband's a fisherman and they just got into seaweed farming. And we're just trying from the time that they decide that's the direction they want to go, we want to work with them to manage expectations and also to be able to grow a crop that fits the market, that as at least as we see it. So that's kind of a way that kind of a very small scale workaround, but I feel like in this conversation, we've talked about a lot about entrepreneurship and it's centered more around farming or harvesting, but there's a lot of entrepreneurship also in the processing and in the product development and in the creating delicious foods side of things, that I think there should be more attention paid to. That's definitely what like my partner and I, we started out wanting to farm, and then we realized that where we could add the most value and be the most fulfilled was through making food. So I would say, like, I don't have like an answer to your question in that there are giant, large scale farms going up in Alaska, and I don't know where they're selling their seaweed. Sometimes they ask us if we want to buy it. But I would say for aspiring farmers really who have that ethos of a responsible and truly regenerative seaweed farm, that finding the market, finding the people that are going to buy it ahead of time and kind of working with them collaboratively to build out the direction that they're going to go so they don't lose it all. Because the last thing we want is for coastal peoples who have had such a hard time for so long to fall for another like gold rush or green rush and lose everything. So I really think that it's this collaboration, this networking, this entrepreneurship at all scales, or at all steps in the process, not at all scales necessarily. That is the way that we can move forward and get more people eating seaweed, because it is so good for us. And coastal, and then I'll be quiet in a moment, but coastal cultures have eaten seaweed forever. It is like truly a good food for us. And I think that we've lost a lot of that in North America, but not all of it. And so working to revive some of that and get it back into people's kitchens is really important.
Well, and back to your point about young people entering, we have the young farmers movement has been going on continuously since agriculture began through the process of apprenticeship. And so one of the ways to burst the bubble is go out on deck and be helpful and see the reality of the situation. And I think, Greenhorns has been here as a network for young farmers to meet each other and hear the truth of their situation from each other, feel team spirit, etc. And I think that it is through that kind of cultural organizing that we can also strengthen our ethical values, our ethical commitment to participating in the shared governance.
What was that? Oh, might have been.
I think she
Keep
might
going,
have been
sorry.
talking to somebody else.
Yeah.
Anyway, the point of the story is together we're stronger. And we hope that some of you at least will join along in the next part of this growing Seaweed Commons. And we hope it to be extremely fruitful and diverse and abundant and fun. And if anyone ever wanted to come and harvest seaweed in Maine, they're welcome to come to my farm. I'm sure that Amanda would welcome you the same. And I know that the network of Seaweed Commoners who've been signing on as signatories, all of us are committed to education and getting us all back in touch with our algae mother.
Awesome. Derek, we are short on time. Do you have a quick question you can bring in?
Yeah, it's just really quick, and it probably can be a yes or no. Derek Robinson, he, him, his, aquaculture economist for the National Marine Fishery Services. Just wondering, had there been any kind of economic analysis done looking at some of those contributions to the seaweed to those polyculture projects?
sounds like we need to have more of that.
Yes. I'm not aware of any, but it would be amazing if we were to do that. I don't know if we could connect further.
Well, we have a good metric with the FAO voluntary guidelines for sustainable small scale fisheries that is very much understanding that the sustainable development goals of the UN need to show preference to the needs of small coastal communities. So if the same perspective is brought into a North American context, that would seem like a pretty good start on a next study that I would be happy to participate in.
Awesome. And as is usual, when time is coming to a close is when all the questions and conversation starts stirring up. So this is until 2:45, so we're closing out now. But I want to make sure that everyone feels like there's opportunities to connect with Seaweed Commons. We'll shoot out a follow-up email that'll give more direct info for how to join these calls and such. But real quick, Amanda, Severin, or Avery, do y'all want to shout out specific things to check out your websites, any links from Seaweed Commons, if there is an online sign-up thing that you haven't put in the chat so far?
I'll leave the Seaweed Commons thing to Severin, because Elena is really the one who does that. But I put my website in the link, and I just published a book called The Science and Spirit of Seaweed last year, and it's lots of information on seaweed and also my personal sort of love affair with seaweed. So if anyone's interested in learning more about algae, seaweed, and its role, its beauty, its mystery, its role in keeping our planet healthy, it's something maybe to check out. It's really good. Avery?
Yes, check it out. No, I just put my email in there. Feel free to email or check out our website, daybreakseaweed.com. Thank you guys all so much.
Thank you for your interest, everyone, and bring someone else to the beach.
And then also one last thing I'll say is, with the Local Catch Network, if you are looking for opportunities to get to meet some of these folks and have these conversations in person and such, October 2nd and 3rd, the Local Catch Summit is going to be happening up in Girdwood, Alaska, and registration is still open, and I'm sure a link to the registration is going to be popping in a chat in some kind of magical second, and y'all should come out. There's going to be a lot of really incredible people there, a lot of really awesome conversations, and I'm sure this very conversation, if it's not continuing in the Seaweed Commons Zoom meetings, which y'all should all check out, y'all can continue it there. So really excited to meet a lot of folks in person at the summit. I think it'll be a really awesome time. Awesome. Any closing thoughts from the Seaweed crew?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming. And I encourage everyone, if you're interested, to read the position paper and to just, have those conversations that just like any kind of farming, there's a right way and a wrong way. And we really want to spread the vision and support those who are doing it the right way.
And a big thank you to Elena, our kind Commons facilitator, who brought us to this point, and all the many people who aren't here on this call because of time zone constraints, who've been a part of this bundling, and all the people who aren't yet part of a bundle. We look forward.
Yeah, Elena and Sarah too. We have great support. It's absolutely wonderful. And please join us. Stay in touch.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you on the next call. We're all on together. Peace.
We have John Russell.